She didn't write a letter. She didn't send word ahead. Isabella Navarro just rode onto Coulter Hale's land one scorching afternoon with dust on her boots and a proposition that would get them both killed. She needed a husband, not for love, not for comfort, but for survival. The most dangerous man in Red Creek County had decided her family was done, and she had run out of quiet ways to fight back. What happened next changed everything about who Coulter thought he was, and what he believed he still had left to lose. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Like the video, stay until the end. This one's worth it. The summer that year came down on West Texas like something personal. By mid-July, the creek beds had cracked into dry plates of mud. The cattle were losing weight no matter how much Coulter moved them, and the dust that lifted off the flats each afternoon settled into everything: the bedding, the flour sack, the crease behind a man's ears. It wasn't the worst drought Coulter Hale had seen in his 41 years, but it was close. And there was something about this particular heat that felt less like weather and more like a slow, deliberate pressure. Like the land itself was trying to decide something. Coulter worked through it the way he worked through everything, methodically, without much conversation, with the particular focus of a man who had learned not to borrow trouble from tomorrow when today had plenty of its own. He was up before light every morning, fed the horses, checked the water troughs, walked the fence line on the eastern pasture where the posts were getting soft. He ate his meals standing at the kitchen counter because it felt wasteful to push back a chair and sit down properly when there was nobody across from him to make it worth the effort. He wasn't miserable. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He had chosen this. After Margaret died, 8 years ago now, though some mornings it still sat on his chest like something fresh, he had deliberately narrowed his life down to what he could manage alone. The ranch, the cattle, the small, honest work of keeping a piece of land from falling apart. He was good at it. The place was clean, the herd was healthy, his credit at the hardware store in Red Creek was solid, and nobody had a reason to bother him. That was what passed for a good life in Coulter Hale's accounting, and he had been more or less at peace with the math. He was mending a stretch of fence on the south pasture when he heard the horse. Not the sound of cattle or a loose animal wandering through. This was deliberate hoofbeats, coming up the wagon road from the direction of town. He straightened, pushed his hat back, and watched. The sun was directly overhead and mean about it, and he had to squint hard before the shape resolved itself into a rider. A woman, on a bay mare, moving at a pace that wasn't frantic but wasn't casual either. The pace of someone who had made up their mind about something and didn't want to give themselves time to unmake it. She pulled up about 20 feet from him. The mare was breathing hard and there was dried sweat on her neck. The woman looked like she'd been riding for a while. She was maybe 27, 28. Dark hair pulled back under the brim of a wide hat. Brown skin weathered from sun. Sharp, watchful eyes that took him in quickly. His work gloves, the fence tool in his hand, the sweat staining the front of his shirt, and then held steady. "You're Coulter Hale," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am. I'm Isabella Navarro. My father is Ramon Navarro. He runs the mercantile on Sutter Street in Red Creek." Coulter knew the name. He'd bought seed and harness oil from Ramon Navarro a handful of times over the years. Good man, quiet, ran a fair store. "I know your father," Coulter said. "Then you know he's an honest man." She swung down from the mare without being invited, which told him something about her. She tied the reins to the fence post he'd just been working on and turned to face him directly. "I need to talk to you about something that's going to sound strange. I'd appreciate it if you'd hear me out before you say no." Coulter looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled the glove off his right hand, tucked it into his back pocket, and gestured toward the shade of a mesquite tree about 30 feet off. "There's not much shade, but there's some. You want water first? Please." He got the canteen from where it hung on the fence post, handed it to her, and walked with her to the tree. They stood in the thin strip of shadow. She drank, handed the canteen back, and then folded her hands in front of her and looked at him with an expression that was utterly controlled except for something around the eyes that wasn't quite steady. "Darius Crow has been taking money from my father for 3 years," she said. Coulter said nothing. "Every month. First it was $50, then it was $70. Now it's $110. Crow calls it a county business fee. There's no such thing. He made it up. He collects it from my father, from the Tanner family at the feed store, from 3 ranchers south of town that I know of, and from the widow Parrish who runs the laundry." She paused. "You know who Darius Crow is?" "He's the sheriff." "He is. And he's been the sheriff for 6 years, and in those 6 years he's built himself a very comfortable arrangement where the people who pay stay safe and the people who don't have problems." Her voice was flat, not emotionless, controlled, like she'd rehearsed this part until the feeling got wrung out of it. "Last month my father told him he couldn't pay. Business was slow, he didn't have it. Crow's deputy came to the store the next morning and broke the front window, walked right in, picked up a lamp, threw it through the glass, and walked out. Didn't say a word. Coulter set the canteen down at the base of the tree. He looked out across the flat, bright land. "And now," she said, "Crow has started paying attention to me." That turned him back around. Her jaw was set. "He came into the store himself 2 weeks ago. My father wasn't there. Crow stood at the counter and talked to me for 20 minutes. He was very polite. He told me my father was getting old, that he worried about men my father's age working so hard, that it was a shame a man like my father didn't have a son to help carry the load." She looked at Coulter steadily. "Then he said it would be a very bad thing if anything happened to Ramon Navarro's health." The silence stretched out. "I need a husband," Isabella Navarro said. "I need a husband who isn't afraid of Darius Crow. And I need him to marry me quickly, so that my father has someone standing beside him before Crow decides that whatever he's been patient about is finished." Coulter took his hat off and ran his hand through his damp hair and put the hat back on. He looked at this woman, this stranger standing in a thin sliver of mesquite shade on his land, asking him for the most consequential thing one person could ask another person for, and tried to find something to say that was adequate to the moment. He couldn't find it. "Why me?" he finally said. "Because you have no debts to Crow. Because you own land, which means he can't threaten your livelihood the way he threatens men who lease. Because you've lived here 11 years without a scandal or a criminal complaint or a known enemy, which means your word has weight in this county." She paused. "And because you live alone, which means you have no family, Crow can threaten to make you back down." It was a thorough answer. It was also, he realized, an answer that had taken some research. She hadn't ridden out here on instinct. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've been thinking about almost nothing else for 2 weeks." He looked at her hands. They weren't shaking, but the way she was holding them together, the deliberate stillness of it, told him she was working to keep them that way. "Miss Navarro," he said carefully, "this is not a small thing you're asking." "No." She met his eyes. "It isn't. Marriage is... I know what marriage is, Mr. Hale." Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge to it. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking you to pretend we have something we don't. I'm asking you to stand up beside me in a legal, recognized way, so that when Darius Crow looks at my family, he sees that we are not alone and unprotected." She let out a short breath. "I'm asking you to be a wall. I can do the fighting myself." Coulter studied her. He believed her on that last part. "I'll need to think," he said. She nodded once, short and precise. "That's fair." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "That's my father's address and the store address. If your answer is yes, come before the end of the week. If I don't hear from you by Sunday, I'll understand." She untied the mare, put her foot in the stirrup, and swung up with practiced ease. For a moment she looked down at him from the saddle, and there was something in her face that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite despair, but was somewhere in the hard country between them. "I know this isn't a fair thing to put on a stranger," she said. "No," Coulter agreed. "It isn't." She nodded again, turned the mare, and rode back down the wagon road the way she'd come. He watched her until she was a small, dark shape in the shimmer of heat rising off the flats, and then until she was gone entirely. He stood there in the thin shade for a long time after that, listening to the dry wind and the distant complaint of a cow somewhere in the back pasture, turning the whole encounter over in his mind like a stone he'd found in the field that might be ordinary or might be something else entirely. Bog. He didn't sleep well that night. He cooked dinner, ate it, washed the plate in the pan, and then sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold while he stared at the lamp and thought. Outside, the heat had let up maybe 5 degrees from the afternoon, which meant it was merely punishing instead of brutal, and some kind of insect was going in the dry grass beyond the window screen with a rhythm that should have been soothing, but wasn't. Darius Crow. Coulter had been careful, in 11 years in Red Creek County, to have as little to do with Darius Crow as possible. This wasn't cowardice, or at least he hadn't examined it long enough to know if it was. It was more a survival instinct he'd developed after watching what happened to people who pulled at the wrong threads. Crow was the kind of man who held his power loosely enough that it looked casual and tightly enough that you only noticed the grip when it was already around your throat. He was big, not fat, but substantial, the kind of physical presence that filled a doorway and made you aware of it. He wore his sheriff's star the way some men wore expensive watches, not as a symbol of duty, but as proof of status. He smiled a lot, which on another man might have been reassuring, but on Crow always felt like the smile was slightly ahead of whatever he was actually thinking. Coulter had seen him work a room at the Stockmen's Association meeting 2 years back, watched him move from table to table, hand on shoulders, laughing at just the right moments, remembering details about men's families and farms and horses that made those men feel seen. It was impressive, in the way that a well-built trap was impressive if you were looking at it from a distance. He thought about Ramon Navarro's broken window, the lamp lifted up without a word and thrown through it, casual as discarding a cigarette. He thought about Isabella's face when she'd said, "He started paying attention to me." There was a particular kind of danger that came with that sentence, and he wasn't naive enough not to understand what it meant and what it could lead to if nobody stopped it. He also thought about his own life. He was 41 years old. He had a ranch that was paid off, a herd that was holding, a reputation that was solid, and almost no one who would notice much in a day-to-day way if he ceased to exist. His neighbor Ed Rafter came by every few months to borrow something or return something borrowed. The pastor in Red Creek would probably remember his name if prompted. There were a handful of men at the stockmen's meetings who'd nod at him and maybe exchange 30 words across a season. That was the shape of his life. He had built it deliberately, and it had cost him something he didn't look at directly most days. He was not unhappy. But the coffee was cold, and the lamp was burning low, and there was no one in the house except him. He got up, poured the cold coffee out, and stood at the window looking at nothing. "I'm asking you to be a wall. I can do the fighting myself." He went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time, but by the time the first gray light came through the east window, he had made his decision, and it sat in his chest with the particular settled weight of something he wasn't going to change. He rode into Red Creek the next morning. The Navarro Mercantile was on Sutter Street, as she'd said, a solid, wide-fronted building with a repaired front window that still had the ghost outline of where the new glass had been set in fresh putty. The kind of repair done quickly and quietly, without complaint. He noted it. He tied his horse at the post out front and went inside. The store smelled of leather and grain and the faint sweetness of dried apple. Ramon Navarro was behind the counter, a compact man in his mid-60s with gray at his temples and reading glasses on a cord around his neck. He looked up when Coulter came in, and there was a wariness in his expression that softened slightly when Coulter took his hat off. "Mr. Navarro," Coulter said. "My name is Coulter Hale. I ranch out on the South Flats, past the Dry Fork Cutoff." Ramon set down what he'd been reading. "I know who you are, Mr. Hale. My daughter mentioned she'd gone to see you yesterday." "She did." Coulter turned his hat in his hands. "I'd like to speak with her, if she's here. And with you, if that's agreeable." Ramon looked at him for a long moment with the careful eyes of a man who had learned to read people the hard way. Then he nodded toward the back room door. "She's in the back. I'll get her." Isabella came out from the back of the store wiping her hands on a cloth, and when she saw Coulter standing there, she stopped moving for just a beat. Not surprise exactly, but something recalibrating. And then she folded the cloth carefully and set it on the counter. "Mr. Hale." "Miss Navarro." He looked from her to her father and back again. "I came to say yes, if the offer is still on the table." The silence in the store had a texture to it. Ramon Navarro made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Isabella held very still. "You're sure?" "I thought about it most of the night. I'm sure." She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd looked at him yesterday when she first got off the horse. That rapid, thorough assessment. Whatever she was looking for, she apparently found enough of it. "I want to be clear about what I told you yesterday," she said. I'm not asking you to perform a feeling you don't have, but I'm asking you to commit, fully. Whatever comes with this, the risk, the trouble, the difficulty, I need to know you won't be looking for a door. I understand that. Because once we do this, Crow will know, and he will make it harder. I expect he will. Her father was standing very still at the counter. His hands were flat on the wood surface, and his eyes were wet, though he was working not to let them be. Then we should see about getting it done quickly, Isabella said. They married 4 days later. It was not a big ceremony. They stood in the front room of Justice of the Peace Cal Hester's home on Thursday morning, with Ramon Navarro on one side and Cal's wife Doris on the other as witnesses. And Coulter said what he was supposed to say, and Isabella said what she was supposed to say, and Cal declared them married in the eyes of the state of Texas, and that was the sum of it. Coulter had worn his second-best shirt, which was cleaner than his best shirt because he wore his best shirt more often. Isabella wore a dress the color of deep blue water that she'd clearly had for a while but had pressed carefully. Her hair was down, which was the first time he'd seen it that way, and it changed her face a little, something less guarded in it, though that might have been his imagination. After, they stood on Cal Hester's porch while Cal and Doris went inside to sign the paperwork, and it was the first moment since they'd met that didn't have a practical task to fill it, and the quiet between them was a strange kind. "Thank you," Isabella said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the street, at a wagon rolling past, at the ordinary Tuesday morning life of Red Creek going on unaware. "I know this isn't what you planned for your life." "I wasn't planning much," Coulter said honestly. She glanced at him. Still, he thought about what to say to that. He settled on nothing, which felt like the right call. Cal came out with the signed paper and gave it to them and shook Coulter's hand and wished them well with the sincerity of a man who didn't fully understand the situation but could tell it wasn't entirely a happy one. His wife gave Isabella a long look that had a question in it, and Isabella gave her a look back that closed the question gently but completely. They walked back to the Mercantile together. The street was busy enough that people noticed. Several heads turned. One woman stopped and stared in a way she must have thought was subtle. Word would move through Red Creek by afternoon. That was the point. That was one of the points. Ramon had tea and cold biscuits waiting for them at the back table. He poured cups with hands that weren't entirely steady and sat down across from his daughter and new son-in-law, and then seemed to run out of things to do with himself. "You should know," Ramon said to Coulter, not quite meeting his eyes, "that I have tried to handle this myself. I paid for as long as I could. I tried to talk to the county commissioner last winter. He stopped, cleared his throat. "Crow has more friends than people know." "What did the commissioner say?" Coulter asked. "He said he'd look into it. That was 8 months ago." Ramon's mouth tightened. "I should have found another way sooner." "Papa?" Isabella said quietly. "I put you in a position where you had to—" "Papa." Her voice was firm, but not harsh. "We are past the point of that conversation. We move forward now." Ramon looked at her and something in him seemed to let go of a particular weight. He picked up his tea. Coulter ate his biscuit and looked at these two people. This father and daughter who had built something together and were watching someone try to take it apart piece by piece, and felt the settled weight of his decision move from his chest down into something more solid, like it had found where it was supposed to live. He said, "Tell me everything you know about Crow's operation. Every name, every incident, every detail you can remember. I want all of it." Isabella reached under the table and produced a journal, worn at the corners, the pages thick with her careful handwriting. She set it on the table in front of him. "I've been keeping records for 14 months, she said. He looked at the journal. He looked at her. "You started keeping records before you came to me," he said. "I knew we'd need them eventually. I just needed to find the right person to use them with." A beat. "I'm glad you said yes." Coulter pulled the journal toward him and opened it to the first page and began to read. They worked out the practical arrangement with the particular awkwardness of two adults who were not romantic people being forced to negotiate private things. Coulter's ranch was larger and more secure, and after 3 days of conversation, some of it stiff, some of it more honest than either of them expected, they agreed that Isabella and Ramon would move to the ranch. The Mercantile would stay open. Ramon would come into town each day to run it, and one of the Tanner boys who'd been looking for part-time work would help. But the family would sleep somewhere Crow's deputies couldn't reach as easily. Coulter had a second bedroom, which had been a storage room, and he spent 2 evenings clearing it out and putting in a proper bed frame and a chest he'd had in the barn since Margaret died. He did this without comment. Isabella thanked him without excess. What surprised him, and he hadn't expected to be surprised, was how quickly the house changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that was particularly comfortable. Isabella had opinions about where things should be, and she expressed them with a directness that sometimes caught him off guard. And he had habits he'd developed in 11 years of solitude that were occasionally ridiculous when observed from the outside. She reorganized the kitchen shelves on the second morning without asking, and he stood in the doorway looking at it, and then said nothing because she was right. It was better. She cooked dinner the first night, a thing with dried chili and beans and some hard cheese that was simple and good. He ate most of it. "You can tell me if something's wrong with it," she said. "Nothing's wrong with it. You're eating slowly. I'm not used to eating at the table with someone." She looked at him across the table. "That's a sad thing to say. It's just a true thing." She considered that. I suppose truth and sad aren't mutually exclusive. He thought about that for a moment. No, they're not. Ramon arrived 3 days later with 2 wagon loads of their belongings, looking both relieved and guilty about the relief. He was a man who'd spent his life being the protector, and accepting protection did not sit easily on his shoulders. But he set up in the front room and found ways to be useful. He was handy with wood and fixed 3 things on the property in his first week without being asked, as if he needed to pay in labor for what felt like charity, even though it wasn't. Coulter watched him do it and recognized the impulse and left him to it. The first thing Crow did was nothing. 3 weeks passed. Coulter rode into Red Creek several times, went to the hardware store, past the sheriff's office. He saw Crow once, from across the street, a big, deliberate shape on the boardwalk, talking to 2 men Coulter didn't recognize. Crow saw him too. The sheriff looked at him for about 4 seconds with an expression that was pleasantly blank, and then turned back to his conversation. Isabella said, "He's recalculating." "I know," Coulter said. "Don't let the quiet make you careless." "I won't. I mean it. The quiet is the worst part. It's when people let their guard down." He looked at her. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her journal and a pen, and there was a tension around her eyes that told him the 3 weeks of quiet had been harder on her than on him because she knew better than to trust it. "You know how he works," Coulter said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've been watching him work for 3 years. I know how he thinks." She set the pen down. "He'll move when he thinks he has something clean, something that doesn't look like retaliation. That's how he's always done it." What does clean look like for him? An accident, a coincidence, something that makes us feel like we've just had bad luck, so we don't push back. Her voice was level. The window being broken wasn't a mistake. It was a message. He wanted my father to feel unsafe without being able to prove Crow did it. Coulter sat down across from her. The lamp between them made the space feel smaller than it was. "I've been talking to some people," he said. She looked up. "Ed Rafter, out on this North Range. His brother-in-law leases from the county, been paying Crow's so-called fee for 2 years. Tom Aldridge down at the Feed and Grain. He lost a contract with the county last spring that should have been his by every reasonable measure. Went to a man who's been seen in Crow's company." He paused. "There are more. People who've had things happen to them that didn't quite make sense at the time. We need them to talk. Most of them are scared." "I know." She wasn't dismissive about it. Being scared makes sense. Crow doesn't leave obvious marks. That's deliberate. She turned the journal toward him and pointed to a page. "Look at this. 14 months of incidents. Every one of them, on its own, you could explain away. Window broken. Could have been vandals. Cattle that strayed and weren't returned. Could have been an honest mistake. But together, it's a pattern. Together, it's a system." She tapped the page. "We need to show people the whole thing, not just their piece of it, because their piece of it feels like bad luck. The whole thing feels like what it is." Coulter studied the page. The entries were precise. Dates, names, amounts, descriptions. She wrote without decoration, just fact stacked on fact, and the cumulative effect of it was a kind of quiet devastation. "You're good at this," he said. She seemed mildly surprised. "At keeping records. At thinking about it systematically. At seeing the shape of it. She shrugged one shoulder. My father taught me bookkeeping from the time I was 12. You learn to look at numbers and see whether they tell an honest story or a dishonest one. A pause. Crow's story is very dishonest. We'll need to be careful how we bring people in, Coulter said. If Crow finds out we're organizing, he'll move faster. Yes, then we move faster than he expects. She looked at him steadily. Can you bring Ed Rafter to talk? I think so. Then we start there, one person at a time. She picked up her pen again. I'll keep writing everything down. You keep talking to people. And we don't tell anyone more than they need to know, not yet, until we have enough that it can't be stopped. He nodded. He looked at this woman across the lamp, this person he'd married 4 weeks ago, who reorganized his kitchen shelves and ate dinner with him and lay in the next room at night, and he was realizing with a kind of reluctant clarity, quite possibly the most competent person he'd been in close proximity to in years. He pushed back from the table. I'll ride out to Rafters in the morning. Take the East Road, she said, already writing again. Less likely to run into Crow's deputy on patrol. You know his patrol routes? I've known his patrol routes for 8 months. She didn't look up. Get some sleep, Coulter. Tomorrow's a long day. He was halfway to the door when he realized she'd used his first name. It was the first time. He didn't say anything about it. He went to bed. Outside, the summer heat had finally begun to crack at the edges, a faint breath of something cooler moving through the dark. And somewhere in the far pasture, one of the cattle lowed once and then went quiet, and the ranch settled into night like it had done every night for 11 years, except that it was different now. Not better, not worse, just different, in a way he hadn't decided yet what to call. He lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house, the particular creaks and sighs it made when there were more people in it, and thought about Darius Crow sitting across town in his comfortable office, recalculating. Come on then, Coulter thought. Whenever you're ready. He meant it. That surprised him a little. He closed his eyes and was asleep inside of 10 minutes, which was faster than he'd managed in weeks. Something about having decided, and having moved, and having a plan, even a small one. It quieted the noise in his head that usually kept him up past midnight. The ranch breathed around him. The new bed in the storage room was occupied. The kitchen shelves were reorganized into something better, and out in the bunk room his father-in-law was snoring with a regularity that Coulter could hear through 2 walls, and it was, if he was honest, not an unpleasant sound. It meant people were there. It meant he wasn't the only one awake in it. Ed Rafter was a cautious man by nature, the kind who checked the sky twice before deciding whether to bring the hay in. He wasn't a coward. Coulter had seen him pull a calf from a mud bog in a rainstorm without complaint, and he'd buried 2 kids and a wife and kept his ranch going after. But caution was the primary color of how he moved through the world. So when Coulter rode up to his fence line on a Tuesday morning and told him what he was putting together, Ed stood with his arms crossed and his jaw working slowly for a long time before he said anything. You're talking about going up against Crow directly. I'm talking about documenting what he's done and putting it in front of people who can act on it, Coulter said. That's not the same thing. In practice, it is. In practice, maybe. Ed looked out across his pasture. His brother-in-law, the one leasing county land, the one paying Crow's invented fee, had lost 30 pounds in the last year from the stress of it, and Ed had watched that happen and hadn't known what to do about it except feel bad. My brother-in-law's name would have to come into it. Eventually, yes, but not until we have enough that his name being in it doesn't put him alone in the open. How much is enough? More than we have now. Less than everything. Coulter shifted in the saddle. I'm not asking you to do anything today, Ed. I'm asking you to listen to what we've got, and if you think it's credible, maybe tell your brother-in-law there are other people who've had the same experience he has. Ed rubbed the back of his neck. That woman you married, Navarro's daughter, Isabella. She's the one with the records? She is. Ed was quiet again. His horse, tied to the post behind him, shook flies off its ear with a patience that seemed pointed. All right, Ed finally said. I'll come listen. That was how it started. One cautious man agreeing to come listen. He came out to the ranch that Friday evening, sat at the kitchen table across from Isabella, and watched her open the journal and begin walking him through 14 months of documented incidents in her quiet, methodical way. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. The facts, laid out in sequence and connected by dates and names and dollar amounts, did the work themselves. By the time she finished, Ed's arms were no longer crossed. His hands were flat on the table, and he was staring at the open journal like it had said something that startled him. "I didn't know about half of this," he said. "Most people only know their part," Isabella said. "That's how he keeps it manageable. Everyone thinks they've just had bad luck. Tom Aldridge lost that county contract because Crow—" He stopped. "Yes." Ed looked at Coulter. "She know about the Pena family, south of the Dry Fork?" Coulter looked at Isabella. She turned to a page near the back. Ernesto Pena. His fence line was disputed last March. The county surveyor came out and somehow found his boundary 40 feet inside where it had been staked for 20 years. He had to give up the east pasture. Ed let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for a while. "That surveyor is Crow's cousin." Isabella wrote that down without looking up. "I didn't know that." "Thank you." Ed watched her write it. Something in his expression shifted. Less wary, more like a man who had been carrying something heavy and had just found out there was a place to set it down. "What do you need from me?" he said. That was the first crack in the wall. There would be more. They came slowly, with the particular friction of people who had learned to be afraid opening up against the grain of that fear. Coulter did most of the initial riding, out to the farms and ranches, stopping in at the feed store to talk to Tom Aldridge in the back, once driving the wagon into town to sit with the widow Parrish in her laundry, which smelled of hot soap and lye, and where she talked to him in a near whisper, with one eye on the street outside. He was not a natural talker. He knew that about himself. He didn't have the gift for warmth that made people open up quickly. But he had something else, a steadiness, an unhurried quality that told people he wasn't going to flinch, wasn't going to cut and run. And after a few conversations, he realized that was what most of them needed more than charm. They'd had their fill of charming people. Darius Crow was charming. What they wanted was someone who wouldn't leave when it got hard. Isabella worked the other angle. She knew the merchants, knew the women who ran households and businesses, knew which conversations happened in back rooms and which ones happened across store counters. She had a way of talking to people that was direct without being aggressive. She didn't promise things she couldn't guarantee, didn't oversell what they were building, and when someone was frightened, she didn't try to talk them out of it. She just said, "I know. I'm frightened too. We're doing it anyway." That honesty cost her something each time. Coulter watched it when he was there for those conversations and saw the small tightening around her eyes that happened when she said she was frightened. Because it was true. And saying true things out loud has a particular kind of weight. The journal filled up. She started a second one. Ramon, meanwhile, was keeping the mercantile open and behaving as normally as he could manage, which took more discipline than it looked like from the outside. He was a man who'd spent his life being straightforward and performing normalcy while something complicated was building in secret did not come easily. He came home some evenings with a tension in his jaw that Coulter recognized as the product of a long day of not saying what was on his mind. One evening, Coulter was out at the barn when Ramon came and leaned against the doorframe, watching him check the horse's feet. "You think this will work?" Ramon asked. "I think it has a chance," Coulter said, which was as honest as he could be. Ramon was quiet for a moment. "I should have fought back earlier. You had a business to protect, a daughter to protect." "A man tells himself that," Ramon said slowly, "and sometimes it's true, and sometimes it's how he makes peace with being afraid." He paused. "I was afraid." Both things were true at once. Coulter set down the horse's hoof and straightened. "Most true things are more than one thing at once." Ramon looked at him. Then he made a sound that was almost a laugh, short and dry, but genuine. "My daughter says you're not much of a talker." "She's not wrong. She says when you do talk, it's worth listening to." He pushed off the doorframe. "I'm starting to see what she means." He went back inside. Coulter finished with the horses and stood in the barn for a moment, in the dark and the warm smell of hay and animals, and thought about what Ramon had said. Not the compliment, the other part. Both things were true at once. He understood that. He had his own version of it. He was doing this because it was right, and he was also doing it because a woman he barely knew had looked at him across a thin strip of mesquite shade, and he had seen something in her face that he hadn't been able to walk away from. Both things. Neither one canceling the other out. He went inside for dinner. The house was loud that night, comparatively. Ramon was telling a story about something that had happened at the store 30 years ago. A misdelivered shipment of ladies' corsets intended for San Antonio that he'd had to figure out what to do with, and Isabella was laughing properly, the kind of laugh she didn't perform but couldn't stop. And Coulter sat at the table that had been empty for years and ate his food and listened and didn't say much. But the thing that usually lived in his chest, the low-frequency quiet of a house with only one person in it, was gone. He noticed it as an absence. The first real retaliation came on a Wednesday in late August. Coulter had ridden out early to the north pasture to check on a section of fence that had been worrying him. The posts were soft at the base, and the wire was sagging in 2 spots. He found the fence, and he found something else. 3 of his cattle, dead. They'd been shot. Not wandered into a wire, not taken sick. Shot cleanly, grouped together in the corner of the pasture the farthest from the house and the road. He stood there in the early morning heat looking at them for a moment, and then he turned his horse around and rode back to the house. Isabella was in the kitchen when he came in. She looked at his face and put down what she was holding. What happened? 3 head, north pasture, shot. Her expression went still and careful. When? Overnight. Far enough out that we wouldn't have heard it. He poured a cup of water and drank it and set the cup down. It's a message. I know what it is. She pulled out a chair and sat down, and he recognized the gesture. She was making herself sit still so she could think rather than react. He'd seen her do it before. How are you feeling about it? The question was direct enough that it surprised him slightly. Angry, he said. Good. Me too. She folded her hands on the table. He wants us to feel unsafe. He wants us to feel like whatever we're building isn't worth 3 head of cattle, and whatever comes next will be worse. I know what he wants. Then we agree we're not giving it to him. We agree. She looked at him steadily. I'm going to write it down. Date, description, location. We add it to the file. I was going to suggest the same thing. And we don't tell the wider group yet. Not in a way that sounds like we're rattled. Agreed. There was a pause. The morning sounds of the ranch came through the window. Ramon moving around out by the woodpile. A bird somewhere insistent about something, the dry heat already starting to build. Are you actually okay? Isabella said. She said it differently than before, quieter. He thought about the 3 cattle in the north pasture, which were animals he'd worked with and moved and fed. There was a specific kind of anger that came with seeing something you'd cared for treated as a prop in someone else's demonstration. He felt it now, steady and cold under the surface. I'm fine, he said. Then, because she was looking at him in a way that suggested she could tell the difference, I'm angry about the cattle. I'll stay angry. It's useful. She nodded slowly. Don't let it make you hasty. It won't. He looked at her. Don't let it make you scared. Too late for that, she said quietly. But scared and stopped are different things. He sat down across from her. They looked at each other across the kitchen table in the early morning light. This man and woman who were legally married and still mostly strangers, who had built something together in 6 weeks that neither of them had planned for their lives. And the weight of what they were doing sat between them like a third presence at the table. Not comfortable, not easy, but real. We keep going, Coulter said. We keep going, she agreed. The cattle were the first thing. The fence came next. The south pasture fence that Coulter had just repaired was cut in 3 places a week later, clean diagonal cuts that took a pair of wire cutters and some deliberation. It didn't cause serious damage, but it let 6 head wander onto the Tanner property, and he spent the better part of a day getting them back. The week after that, a load of feed he'd ordered from the Aldridge store was shorted, half what he'd paid for, and the receipt mysteriously lost. Tom Aldridge was apologetic and sick with it, because he knew what had happened, and Coulter told him not to worry about it. It's not about the feed, Coulter told him. I know. I hate that it's not about the feed, Tom said. He was a big, soft-spoken man who'd been running his family's store for 15 years and had no talent for conflict. What do you want me to do? Keep your records, write down what happened today, and keep talking to us. Tom looked like he wanted to say something more and couldn't quite find it. He settled for nodding, with the expression of a man bolting himself to a decision he was afraid of and doing it anyway. There were other things, small things, calculated things, the kind designed to drain time and energy and confidence without crossing into anything easily provable. A rumor appeared in town that Coulter's cattle had a blight. It wasn't true and went away in a week. But in the meantime, 2 buyers he'd been in correspondence with sent cautious letters. Isabella heard from a woman she trusted that Crow had been talking, very casually, very pleasantly, about how it was a shame that Coulter Hale had married into trouble, how he hoped it wouldn't affect the man's standing in the county, how he'd always thought Hale was a decent fellow who'd just made a poor choice. "He's trying to separate you from me," Isabella said when she told him. "Make it seem like the trouble is mine and you've been foolish enough to attach yourself to it." "I know. Does it bother you? That people might think that?" He considered the question seriously. "Some of the people who think it aren't worth the worry. Some are. The ones who are, I'll handle by being here and not going anywhere." He looked at her. "Does it bother you that he's framing it that way?" She made a face that was half frustrated, half something else. "It bothers me that it's an effective strategy. People want a simple story. The simple story is that I'm the problem." She paused. "I've been the problem my whole life, in one way or another. I'm used to it." He wanted to say something to that, but she'd already moved on to something in the journal, and the moment passed. He filed it away in the category of things he was learning about her, the things she said without armor on, usually briefly and in passing, as if she hadn't quite meant to. She wasn't an easy person. He could acknowledge that without it being a complaint. She was precise and sometimes sharp and had a habit of being right about things in a way that she didn't make a performance of, which was somehow more difficult to absorb than if she'd crowed about it. She moved through their shared space with the careful deliberateness of someone who was always aware of being a guest, even when she wasn't. She made coffee in the mornings without asking if he wanted any, and just left a cup on the counter for him, which he noticed and said nothing about, and she did the same. They were figuring out the grammar of a shared life, in the same halting way you figure out the grammar of a foreign language, through trial and occasional error and the gradual accumulation of small understandings. It was not romantic. It was something more functional, and he was finding more durable. September came in and the heat broke a little, just enough that the evenings had a breath of something cooler in them. And they'd taken to sitting on the porch after dinner when the work was done. Him in the chair on the left, her in the chair on the right, sometimes talking and sometimes not, watching the dark come in over the flat land. It was on one of those evenings that she said, without preamble, "I think we have enough to approach Judge Whitlock." Coulter turned to look at her. "You sure?" "Not certain, but enough that it's worth the conversation." She had the second journal in her lap, which she'd been going through. "We have 9 families directly affected, documented incidents spanning 3 years, financial records from my father's store showing the extortion payments. Ed Rafter's brother-in-law has agreed to make a statement. The widow Parrish will confirm the payments." She paused. "And I found something in the county records last week that I haven't told you yet." He waited. The land survey that displaced the Pena family, the one done by Crow's cousin. It was filed with an incorrect date. It backdates the survey by 4 months to make it look like it was done before a county ordinance that would have required an independent review. She looked at him. "Someone filed a false document with county records. That isn't just extortion. That's fraud against the county itself." The porch was quiet. Down in the pasture, one of the horses moved. "Whitlock," Coulter said. "Whitlock." She closed the journal. "He's retired, but he still has standing. And he's the one man in this county that Crow has never been able to get anything on because Whitlock doesn't want anything Crow could offer." A pause. "He knew my father 20 years ago. He might listen." Coulter looked out at the dark land. The stars were coming in, sharp and thick, the way they only got when the air finally dried out. "I'll ride to his place tomorrow," he said. "We'll ride," she said. He glanced at her. "This isn't just your fight," she said. "Not sharp, just clear." "It never was." "No," he said. "It never was." They sat for a while longer in the quiet that had become, without either of them deciding it had, a comfortable one. Not the quiet of distance, the quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it. Inside, Ramon had fallen asleep in his chair again, with a book open on his chest, which he did 3 nights out of 5 and then denied every time. The ranch sat under the stars doing what it always did. And in the morning, they would ride out together to see an old judge. And the thing they had been quietly building would move into a new and more dangerous phase. And neither of them said that out loud because they both knew it already. And there was nothing useful in saying what you both already knew. Nathaniel Whitlock lived 7 miles outside Red Creek on a property that had seen better decades but was maintained with the stubborn dignity of a man who refused to let things fall apart on his watch. The house was old wood gone silver gray, the porch slightly uneven, the garden in front planted with the kind of practical things, herbs, a fig tree, some variety of squash, that suggested a man who cooked for himself and didn't romanticize it. He was on the porch when they rode up, as if he'd been expecting them, though they hadn't sent word ahead. He was in his 70s, thin in the way of men who'd always been lean and gotten more so with age, with white hair cut close and the kind of eyes that had spent 40 years in courtrooms looking at people who were lying and had developed an excellent calibration for it. He watched them dismount without getting up. "Ramon Navarro's daughter," he said, looking at Isabella. Not a question. "Yes, sir. Isabella Hale now." She tied the mare to the post. "This is my husband, Coulter." Whitlock looked at Coulter with the same measuring attention. "I know who you are. Rancher, South Flats." He looked back at Isabella. "I heard you got married in a hurry. Figured there was a reason." He finally stood slowly, with the care of a man whose knees were not what they'd been. "Come inside. I'll make coffee and you can tell me what you want." The inside of the house was mostly books, not decorative books arranged for effect. Working books, marked and stacked and lived in, covering a long table and 2 shelves that bowed slightly under the weight. A wood stove in the corner even though it was too warm for it. A single window that looked out on a dry creek bed. He made coffee without asking how they took it and set the cups down and sat across from them and folded his hands on the table. "All right," he said, "talk." Isabella opened the journal. She had reorganized it the night before into a sequence she could move through efficiently, and she did. Names, dates, amounts, incidents, connecting threads. She didn't rush, and she didn't editorialize. She let the record speak and came in only to explain the connections. Whitlock listened without interrupting. He was absolutely still while she talked, the way a man gets still when he's concentrating hard, and his eyes moved between her face and the pages of the journal with the focused attention of someone taking in information rather than waiting for a pause to speak. When she got to the falsified survey document, he held out his hand and she gave him the copy she'd made at the county records office. He read it carefully. Then he read it again. "Who else has seen this?" he said. "No one outside this room," Isabella said. "And my father." Whitlock set the paper down. He picked up his coffee cup, found it had gone cold, set it back down. "The date discrepancy. You're certain about the ordinance timeline?" "I have the ordinance date from the county record book. March 14th. The survey is dated November of the prior year, but the survey references a boundary marker that wasn't installed until February. I found the installation record from the county works ledger." She paused. "Someone changed the survey date after the fact, but they didn't check what the survey itself referenced." Whitlock looked at her for a moment. "You found that yourself?" "I did." "How long did that take?" "About 3 weeks of going through records on days when the county clerk was at lunch." He was quiet for a moment that felt evaluative. Then he looked at Coulter. "And you? What's your stake in this beyond the cattle and the fences?" Coulter said, "My wife's family is being threatened by a man who's been running this county like a personal tax scheme for 6 years. That's enough." "That's a clean answer." Whitlock leaned back. "It doesn't tell me whether you'll hold when it gets worse." "Then you'll have to watch and see." The old judge looked at him for another beat and then made a sound that might have been approval. He turned back to Isabella. "What do you want from me specifically?" "We're going to bring this to a public forum," Isabella said. "We're going to have the affected families speak. I want it to be more than just grievance. I want it to be a formal presentation of documented evidence. If you're there, if you validate what we've assembled, it carries weight that ordinary citizens can't give it." She paused. "And I want to send a copy of everything to federal authorities before the meeting, so that when Crow tries to shut it down or discredit it, there are people already coming who can't be managed by a county sheriff." Whitlock drummed his fingers once on the table. "You've been corresponding with federal authorities?" "Not yet, but I intend to. I'm waiting until we have your answer, because your validation is part of what makes the package credible rather than just a collection of accusations. He looked at her steadily. You planned this sequence deliberately. Yes. Why federal and not state? Because 2 of the county commissioners are photographed at Crow's annual hunting party. I don't know what that means exactly, but I don't want to find out after the fact that it means something. She met his eyes. Federal is cleaner. Whitlock picked up the falsified survey again, looked at it, set it down. Outside, the dry creek bed was going gold in the afternoon light. The house was very quiet. Your father, he finally said. How is Ramon? He's frightened and too proud to say so, Isabella said. He's holding. Something moved across Whitlock's face that was too brief to fully read. Recognition, maybe, or an old sadness that belonged to a different conversation. He's a good man. He was a good man 20 years ago, and I expect he's a better one now. He stood up carefully, went to the window, stood with his back to them for a moment. I've watched what Crow's done to this county. I've watched it and said nothing because I was retired and it wasn't my fight, and I told myself someone else would take it on. He turned around. No one did. Coulter and Isabella said nothing. I'll validate the evidence, Whitlock said. I'll stand up in whatever forum you arrange and say, on record, that what you've assembled is credible and legally significant, and I'll sign the letter to the federal marshal's office in Austin. He pointed at the survey copy. That document alone is enough to open an investigation. The rest makes it airtight. Isabella exhaled slowly. It wasn't relief so much as the release of a pressure that had been building for a long time. Thank you. Don't thank me until it's done, Whitlock said, and sat back down. And understand that when Crow finds out what's coming, and he will find out, because men like him always have someone watching, it's going to move fast and it's going to be ugly. Are your people ready for that? Coulter said, they're as ready as frightened people can be, which is to say, not fully, but enough. Whitlock looked at him with something that was almost approval. Honest answer. He reached for a sheet of paper and a pen. Sit down. Let's talk about the letter. They rode back to the ranch in the early evening with the letter drafted and Whitlock's commitment secured. And the satisfaction of it was real but careful. The satisfaction of a step taken in the right direction while knowing there were difficult steps still ahead. Isabella held the copy of the letter inside her coat against her chest. Neither of them talked much. The land was going purple and orange around them, and the first cool air of the season moved across the flats, and it was the kind of evening that would have been peaceful in different circumstances. He's going to find out, Coulter said, when the ranch lights came into view. Yes. How long do you think we have before he moves on something? Less time than we want. She looked at him. We need to get the letter to Austin and set the date for the meeting before he acts. Maybe 2 weeks. 3 at the most. I'll ride the letter to the telegraph office in Grayford tomorrow. Not Red Creek. The telegraph office in Red Creek reports to the county. I know. I was going to suggest Grayford. She paused. Go before dawn. Don't tell anyone where you're going until you're back. He nodded. They rode into the yard and unsaddled in the fading light, and inside the kitchen window Ramon was moving around, cooking something that smelled of onions and cumin, and the ordinary domesticity of it was such a sharp contrast to what the day had contained that it almost made Coulter laugh. Almost. He was in Grayford before 8 the next morning, and the telegram was sent before 9, addressed to the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin with Judge Whitlock's name prominently in the header. The telegraph operator, a boy of about 20 who was professionally indifferent to the content of messages, took the paper without comment and charged him 40 cents, and that was that. 40 cents, and the weight of the thing shifted from purely local to something larger. Coulter rode back to Red Creek County feeling the change of it, like a gear clicking into place. The next 10 days were the most demanding of the whole enterprise. They set the date, a Saturday, 3 weeks out, in the center of Red Creek's main street where the Stockmen's Association sometimes held its public meetings. They began, quietly and carefully, informing their 9 families about the plan. Not all at once, one at a time, with enough detail to prepare them, but not so much that any single leak could blow the whole thing before it happened. Tom Aldridge nearly backed out twice. The first time, Coulter sat with him in the back of the feed store for an hour and let him talk through his fear without arguing with it. The second time, Isabella came, And she said something to Tom that Coulter wasn't in the room for, and when he came back in, Tom's face had settled into something that looked like resolved. He never found out what she'd said, and he didn't ask. The widow Parrish, conversely, was steady as a post once she'd committed. She was 63, had run a business alone for 20 years, and had reached the age where the fear of what other people could do to her life was outweighed by the certainty that she was going to live what was left of it on her own terms. She told Isabella, "I've been paying that man for 4 years, and I'm tired of it down to my bones." And her statement was the most precise and damning of the 9 they had. The Peña family, Ernesto and his wife Clara, were the ones who made it hardest. Ernesto had lost 40 feet of his east pasture to a fraudulent survey, and the land hadn't been returned, and the memory of it had the particular quality of an injustice not yet corrected, still raw and present. He wanted to be there. But he had 3 children, and Clara's fear for them was not irrational, and the conversation they had at the Peña kitchen table one evening was the hardest Coulter and Isabella had. "If something goes wrong," Clara said, "who protects my kids?" Isabella looked at her directly. "I can't guarantee nothing goes wrong. I won't insult you by pretending I can." She paused. "But I can tell you that the more voices we have, the safer everyone is. The more people standing in that street, the harder it is for Crow to make any one of us a target." Clara looked at Ernesto. Ernesto looked at his hands. "He took our land," he said quietly. "He used a lie to take it. My grandfather broke that east pasture." He looked up. "I'll be there." Clara pressed her lips together and didn't argue, which was its own kind of statement. 14 days after the telegram, they received confirmation from the Austin Marshal's office. A formal letter, brief and official, acknowledging receipt of the evidence package and indicating that a federal inquiry had been opened and that a marshal would be dispatched to Red Creek County. No specific date. No names. But it was real, and it was coming, and it meant that whatever happened in that street in 9 days, there was a structure behind it that Crow couldn't simply intimidate away. Isabella read the letter twice standing at the kitchen table and then set it down very carefully, as if it were fragile. "Well," she said. "Well," Coulter agreed. They looked at each other across the kitchen, and there was something in that moment that neither of them put words to. Not celebration exactly, but the recognition of a thing built, stone by stone, out of fear and stubbornness, and the particular kind of hope that isn't optimism, but is more like refusal. Ramon, reading over Isabella's shoulder, made a sound low in his throat and put his hand on her shoulder, and squeezed once. She put her hand over his and held it there for a moment. Crow moved on a Thursday. Coulter was in Red Creek buying lumber when it happened. He was loading the wagon at the hardware store when he heard boots on the boardwalk behind him. Too many, moving with purpose. And by the time he turned around, there were 3 of them. Crow's deputy, Luther Crane, a thick-necked man with a face that showed very little, and 2 others Coulter recognized as men who appeared when things needed doing that the sheriff didn't want to be visibly attached to. "Coulter Hale," Luther said. He had a piece of paper in his hand. "I'm placing you under arrest." Coulter looked at the paper. Then he looked at Luther. "For what?" "Cattle theft." Luther said it without hesitation, with the bored confidence of a man reading from a script he'd already memorized. Specifically, 32 head of cattle belonging to the Brennan Ranch, found in your north pasture 6 days ago. The Brennan Ranch. Coulter had met a man named Brennan once at a stockman's meeting. He ran a modest operation north of town. The accusation was so specific and so structurally clean that it took Coulter a half second to realize exactly what he was looking at. Not a desperate move, but a planned one. The cattle in his north pasture, found 6 days ago. Which meant they'd been put there 6 days ago by someone working for Crow, and someone at the Brennan Ranch had been persuaded or coerced into signing a complaint. He thought about running through all of this out loud and decided against it. He looked at the paper again. It had a judge's signature on it. Not Whitlock, but Harlan Foss, the county circuit judge who appeared at Crow's hunting party in 3 photographs Isabella had found. He handed the paper back. "I'd like to send word to my wife," he said. "You can do that from the jail." "Is that how we're doing this?" Luther met his eyes without expression. "That's how we're doing this." The walk to the jail was short and public. Coulter walked it with his hands in front of him rather than behind, which Luther allowed because arguing about it would have looked worse than allowing it, and Coulter noticed the people on the street who saw him. Their expressions, the way some of them looked quickly away and some of them watched with something complicated in their faces. At least 6 people saw it. He counted. 6 people who knew him, who had been part of the network Isabella had built, who now watched Coulter Hale walk to the jail in Red Creek on a Thursday afternoon. He hoped she'd find out quickly. The jail had 2 cells. The other one was empty. Luther locked the door without ceremony and left him there, and a younger deputy, whose name Coulter didn't know, sat at the desk near the door reading something and didn't look up. The cell had a cot with a thin mattress, a bucket, and a small window that looked out on the side alley. The window was barred. Coulter sat on the cot. He was not panicking. He was not quite calm either, but he was doing the thing he'd learned to do in hard situations, making a deliberate choice not to let the feeling in his chest dictate what his mind did. He thought about the situation clearly and without ornament. Crow had been watching. He'd known the meeting was being organized. Someone had talked, or he'd guessed, or he'd been more attentive than they'd given him credit for. He'd had time to prepare this. The cattle planted, the complaint arranged, the warrant obtained from a friendly judge. It was tidy. It was designed to do several things at once. Remove Coulter from the picture, create a legal cloud over his reputation, and demonstrate to the 9 families that being part of this resistance had tangible, personal consequences. It was, Coulter had to admit, not a stupid move, but it assumed Isabella would panic. He thought about her reading the letter from Austin, the way she'd set it down carefully, the way she'd looked at him across the kitchen with that thing in her face that wasn't optimism, but was more like refusal. He sat back against the wall and waited. The message reached Isabella inside of 40 minutes, brought by a boy from the hardware store who'd seen the arrest and knew where the Hale Ranch was. She was at the kitchen table with the second journal when the boy arrived, breathless and wide-eyed at the door, and she listened to what he said and thanked him and gave him a coin and closed the door. She stood with her back against the door for maybe 10 seconds. Then she moved. She went to the locked box under her bed where she kept the original copies of everything: the journals, the county records, the letter from Austin, the statements she'd been quietly collecting from each family, written and signed and witnessed. She took out the stack and carried it to the kitchen table and sat down and looked at it. Her father appeared in the doorway. "Isabella, what happened?" "They arrested Coulter. Cattle theft. It's fabricated." She was already sorting the papers. "I need you to go to Ed Rafters and tell him what's happened and tell him the meeting is moving up. Not Saturday. As soon as possible. I'll send word when I have a date." She looked up. "Don't go through town. Take the East Road." Ramon looked at the stack of papers and at his daughter's face. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to get my husband out of jail." She said it the way you say something when you've already figured out how and just haven't said it aloud yet. "And I'm going to make sure when he walks out of that building, Darius Crow can't put him back in." She went to see Whitlock that same afternoon. He listened to what she told him, and his face went through something, anger, carefully contained. And then he stood up from his chair with more speed than he'd shown that first day. "The cattle," he said. "You can prove they were moved onto his property?" "I can prove they weren't there 8 days ago. I have a record from Coulter's last full cattle count, documented, with signatures from 2 witnesses who were helping him with the branding." She paused. "And I know Brennan. He's a decent man. He's been pressured into signing something. If I can talk to him without Crow's people present, I think he'll tell me what actually happened." "Go see Brennan," Whitlock said. "I'll draft an emergency writ challenging the warrant on grounds of procedural irregularity. Foss signed it without a proper preliminary hearing, which is technically required. It won't get Coulter out today, but it puts a clock on how long they can hold him without bringing it to open court." "How long?" 4 days. If I push it, maybe 3. He looked at her. "That's your window." "I know." She stood. "I'll be at Brennan's before dark." He stopped her at the door. "Miss Navarro." He said her maiden name, not her married one. She turned. "You built this whole case yourself, before you even found the right person to stand with you." He said it evenly, not as flattery, as fact. "That is not a small thing." She looked at him for a moment. "It wasn't enough by itself." "No, but it was the foundation everything else is sitting on." He nodded once. "Go." She went. Brennan's ranch was north of town. An hour's ride on a horse she pushed harder than she should have. She found him in his barn, a wiry man in his 50s with the look of someone who hadn't slept well in days. When he saw her coming, he stopped what he was doing, and the expression on his face was not hostile. It was ashamed. She got down from the mare and walked up to him and said, "Mr. Brennan, I'm not here to be angry at you. I'm here because I think you know the truth about what happened to those cattle, and I think you're a man who cares about telling it." Brennan looked at her. He looked at the ground. He looked at his hands. "They brought them to me," he said, his voice low. 6 days ago, before dawn. Luther Crane and another man told me these 32 head had been found strayed from my land and recovered from Hale's north pasture. Said all I had to do was sign the complaint and there'd be no more trouble. He swallowed. I said they weren't my cattle. They said they were now. He looked up. "I have kids too, ma'am." "I know," Isabella said quietly. "I signed because I didn't know what else to do. I know." She held his gaze. "Will you tell the truth? In public? In front of witnesses, when I ask you to?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she could hear the horses in the stalls shifting and the wind picking up outside, and somewhere on the roof a loose piece of tin starting to rattle. "Yes," he said finally. It came out rough, like it had to get past something. "Yes, I'll tell the truth." She rode back toward Red Creek in the last of the evening light, with Brennan's statement in her saddlebag and Judge Whitlock's writ being prepared, and the federal letter already dispatched to Austin and 9 families who had agreed to stand in a street and say what had happened to them. And at the center of all of it, Coulter in a cell he shouldn't be in, waiting. She thought about the morning they'd come back from Whitlock's the first time, the way he'd ridden beside her in the quiet without needing to fill it, the way he'd said "my wife's family" to Whitlock like it was something he'd always known. She thought about the coffee cup always on the counter, the way he'd looked at the cattle in the north pasture and come home angry and quiet and not broken. She thought about what it was like to have someone who did not look for the door. She nudged the mare faster. The lights of Red Creek were coming up ahead, small and yellow in the blue-gray of dusk. And somewhere in that town was the jail, and somewhere in the jail was a man sitting on a thin mattress in a locked room, waiting. She was not going to let him wait long. Coulter spent 2 nights in that cell. The first night was the harder one, not because of physical discomfort, though the cot was thin and the cell held the day's heat until well past midnight. It was harder because his mind kept working the problem from every angle, turning it over, looking for the thing he'd missed, the move he should have anticipated. He'd known Crow would retaliate. He and Isabella had talked about it specifically, had tried to account for the shapes that retaliation might take, but they'd been thinking about threats and vandalism, about the kinds of slow pressure Crow had been applying for months. They hadn't fully accounted for a legal move, a warrant, a judge's signature. The particular trap of being on the wrong side of official paperwork in a county where the officials answered to the wrong man. He lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling and made himself stop trying to solve it. Isabella had the evidence. Isabella had Whitlock. She'd been building toward exactly this kind of moment for longer than he'd known her, and she was, if he was being accurate about it, considerably better at this kind of work than he was. His job right now was to stay calm and not do anything that gave them a reason to add charges or extend the hold. He slept badly, but he slept. The second day passed with the particular grinding slowness of enforced idleness. The young deputy brought him food twice, beans and bread, edible but not of interest, and didn't make conversation. Luther Crane came in mid-morning and stood outside the cell for a moment, looking at Coulter with that flat, professional expression. "You're going to want to think about what you've been doing," Luther said. "Man with a good property, solid standing, lot to lose." Coulter looked at him. "I haven't lost anything yet." "You might." "Then I'll deal with it then." Luther stood there a moment longer, waiting for something. Anxiety, maybe, or the first crack of a man reconsidering, and when he didn't get it, he walked back out without another word. What Coulter didn't know, sitting in that cell through the long second afternoon, was the scale of what was moving outside of it. Isabella had not slept. Not the first night, not much of the second. She'd spent the hours that should have been sleep writing and organizing and writing, and by the morning of the second day she had done the following. Secured Whitlock's writ, which had been formally filed with the county clerk at 7 in the morning by Whitlock himself, in person, which the clerk could not refuse to accept, spoken to Brennan a second time, and obtained a written, witnessed statement. Sent word to all 9 families that the meeting was in 2 days, Saturday, as originally planned, Not moved up, not moved back, because changing the date in response to the arrest would signal panic, and sent a second telegraph from Grayford, this one directly to the marshal's office, informing them of the arrest and the fabricated charges. She did this on approximately 4 hours of broken sleep, on a horse that needed more rest than it got, fueled by coffee and a stubbornness that had been running in her family for at least 3 generations. Ramon helped where he could and stayed out of her way where he couldn't, which was the most useful thing he could do. Ed Rafter rode 12 miles on the second morning to come and ask what he could do, and she put him to work delivering messages to 3 of the families she hadn't been able to reach personally. He did it without complaint and was back by evening. The writ created the pressure point Whitlock had intended. Foss, the circuit judge, received it on the second afternoon and found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to respond to a challenge from a retired judge with 40 years of legal standing and a reputation that made him difficult to simply ignore. He sent word to the jail. Coulter would be brought before him the following morning for a formal hearing on the warrant's validity. Isabella received this news from Whitlock's messenger and sat with it for a moment. "That's tomorrow morning," she said. "Yes," Whitlock said. He'd come himself rather than sending word, which told her how seriously he was taking it. He was sitting across from her at the kitchen table, his hat on the chair beside him, his hands folded. He looked tired in a way that wasn't physical. Foss is going to try to sustain the warrant. He'll argue the procedural challenge is insufficient, but he'll have to do it on the record, in front of anyone who chooses to attend a public hearing. Then people need to know about the hearing. Yes, and they need to be there. She looked at him. "Will you argue it?" "I'm not licensed to appear as counsel anymore, but I can sit in that courtroom as a citizen, and when Foss makes his ruling, whatever it is, I can stand up and address the court as a former officer of the law." He paused. "It's irregular. He might try to remove me, but removing me from a public hearing is its own kind of statement. How many people do we need in that room?" "As many as you can get." She was already reaching for her coat. The hearing was at 9 in the morning. By 8:30, the street outside the county courthouse, a 2-story building on the corner of Main and Sutter, had more people on it than typically gathered outside that building for anything short of a major land auction. Not a mob, not a demonstration, exactly. Just people, standing in the morning light, talking quietly in 2s and 3s, waiting. Tom Aldridge was there. The widow Parrish was there, in her good dress, with her hands folded and her jaw set. Ed Rafter stood near the back with his brother-in-law, a man named Daniel, who looked like he hadn't slept well in 2 years. The Pena family was there, Ernesto in front, Clara beside him, both of them with the kind of deliberate stillness of people who had made a frightening decision and were holding on to it with both hands. The Tanner brothers were there, Brennan was there, standing slightly apart from the others, looking at the courthouse steps with the expression of a man carrying something heavy toward a place to set it down. Crow was there too. He was standing on the opposite boardwalk with 2 of his men, watching the crowd assemble with an expression that was still controlled but had something moving underneath it. Not quite worry, not quite anger, but an awareness that the situation had not developed the way he'd intended. Isabella arrived with Whitlock at 8:40. She walked through the assembled people, exchanging small nods and brief words, checking faces, reading readiness. She found what she needed, not confidence exactly, but the particular quality of people who had decided something and were done deciding. That was enough. She stopped when she reached the courthouse steps and turned to look back at the street. At all of it. 14 months of records, 9 families, 1 retired judge, 1 honest rancher in a jail cell, and the accumulated weight of 6 years of a county being told that what was happening to them was their own fault or their own bad luck. She turned back around and went inside. Foss ran the hearing the way a man runs something when he knows the outcome but has to perform the process. He was in his 50s, red-faced, with the slightly elevated energy of someone who'd been given instructions he didn't enjoy but intended to follow. He laid out the warrant, presented the theft charge, called Luther Crane as the arresting officer. Luther gave his testimony with mechanical precision. Then Whitlock stood up from the gallery. Foss looked at him. "This is not an open forum, Nathaniel." "I'm aware of that, Harlan." Whitlock's voice was even and carried easily through the room. "I filed a procedural challenge to this warrant 2 days ago, and it has not been formally addressed. I'd like it addressed on the record." The challenge was reviewed. "Where's the record of that review?" Whitlock asked. "Because a procedural challenge to a warrant requires documented response. I've seen no documentation. The room was very still. Foss's jaw tightened. He was doing the calculation visible on his face. How far to push this? What it would look like? Who was watching? The courtroom had more observers than it usually held for a preliminary hearing. He knew that. The challenge is noted, Foss said carefully. I'd like it addressed. A pause. State your challenge formally. Whitlock laid it out. The missing preliminary hearing, the timeline irregularities, and then, with the calm of a man who had been in courtrooms for 4 decades and knew exactly when to play what, he introduced Brennan's written statement, delivered it to the clerk himself, who had no procedural grounds to refuse it. Then he said, I'd also like to note for the record that the cattle in question were not in Mr. Hale's north pasture 8 days ago, as evidenced by a witnessed cattle count with 2 signatures conducted by the accused himself, which I am also entering into the court record. Foss looked at the documents. He looked at Whitlock. He looked at the room. The room had 27 people in it, more than he'd expected, more than he was comfortable with. He recessed for 15 minutes. When he came back, his face was doing something complicated that wasn't quite the same as before. He sustained the procedural challenge. The warrant, he ruled, required supplemental evidence and a full preliminary hearing before it could justify continued detention. Coulter Hale was to be released pending that hearing, which would be scheduled within 30 days. It wasn't an acquittal. It wasn't even close to a resolution. But Coulter walked out of that jail at 11 in the morning on a Saturday, into sunlight that felt different from the light he'd walked into on a normal day, and Isabella was standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps. She didn't run to him. She walked, which was more her style, and she stopped in front of him and looked at his face the way she'd looked at him the first time. That thorough, rapid assessment. And then she said, You look terrible. I've been in a cell for 2 days. You need to eat something. I need to know what's happening. I'll tell you everything. First you eat. She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she said quieter, I'm glad you're out. I'm glad I'm out too. There was a beat between them that had something in it neither of them named. Then Ed Rafter appeared at Coulter's elbow and shook his hand hard and said something about time, and the moment passed into the busy work of the morning. But Coulter had seen it, and he filed it away with the other things he was learning about who she was. They had 1 day to prepare for the main event. 1 day to move from the procedural victory of the courthouse hearing to the larger, more public confrontation that Isabella had been building toward for 14 months. The hearing had given them something unexpected, not just Coulter's release, but a demonstration. 27 people had seen Whitlock challenge Foss and win, had seen official paperwork crumble under the weight of documented truth, and that demonstration had moved through Red Creek with the particular speed of news that surprises people. By Saturday morning, the gathering on Main Street was not 9 families. It was closer to 50 people. Some had come out of direct grievance. Some had come because they'd heard what happened at the courthouse and were curious. Some came because their neighbors were going, and in a small county, standing alone when your community is doing something feels worse than the thing itself. Whatever the reason, they were there. Ranchers, merchants, farmhands, 2 school teachers, the owner of the hotel on the south end of Maine, a handful of people Coulter didn't recognize who turned out to be from the outlying districts, word having traveled further than any of them had planned. Crow was there too. Of course he was. He stood on the boardwalk in front of his office, which faced Main Street, in his full uniform with his star prominent, flanked by Luther and 2 other deputies. He was not moving. He was watching. His expression was the same controlled pleasantness he wore in public, but the pleasantness had gone slightly mechanical, the face of a man performing a feeling he no longer had access to naturally. Isabella stood at the center of the street with her 2 journals and the stack of documents she'd assembled and organized and carried through 14 months of quiet, dangerous work. Whitlock was beside her, a step back, present, visible, but making clear that the floor was hers. She didn't have a podium or a platform. She stood on the packed dirt of Main Street in her good dress, with her dark hair back under her hat, and her voice carrying in the dry, still morning air, and she began. Most of you know something happened to you, she said. I want to show you that what happened to you wasn't an accident. She started with the payments, the extortion scheme, its structure, its timeline. She named numbers and dates and amounts, not to humiliate anyone in the crowd, but to establish the pattern. She named the mechanism, the county business fee that didn't exist, the deputies who appeared when payments were missed, the carefully deniable consequences. She spoke for about 10 minutes, laying the framework, and the street was quiet in the way streets get quiet when people are listening hard. Then she stepped back and said, "Mr. Rafter." Ed Rafter came forward. He was not a natural public speaker. He held his hat in his hands and his voice was rough, and he looked at his boots more than at the crowd. But he said what had happened to his brother-in-law in plain, blunt language, and the plainness of it was more convincing than eloquence would have been. Daniel, Ed's brother-in-law, spoke after. His voice shook at first and then steadied. He said the amount he'd paid over 2 years. He said what had happened when he'd been late. He said it looking straight ahead, not at Crow's boardwalk, not at the ground. The widow Parrish spoke. She was not shaky. She stood with her hands folded and looked at the crowd and said she'd paid $110 a month for 4 years. And she wanted it said publicly that this was theft, and she was done pretending it was anything else. Ernesto Peña spoke. He described the survey, the boundary, the east pasture his grandfather had broken. His voice was low and even, and had the quality of someone who has decided that anger is too precious to spend on performance. Brennan spoke last before the documents. He looked worse than anyone, pale, with shadows under his eyes. But he said what he'd said to Isabella in his barn, and he said it clearly. The cattle had been brought to him before dawn. He had not reported them stolen because they were not his cattle. He had signed the complaint under duress. He looked at the courthouse steps when he said it, and then he looked at Crow's boardwalk, and then he looked away. Crow had not moved. His face had gone from controlled pleasantness to controlled blankness, which was its own kind of tell. Then Whitlock stepped forward and addressed the crowd in the way a man addresses a crowd when he has spent 40 years doing it professionally and knows exactly how much weight his words carry in a space like this. He validated the evidence, the journal records, the financial documents, the county records showing the falsified survey date, the discrepancy between the survey's stated date and the boundary marker's installation record. He used the word fraud. He said it clearly, and then he said it was his professional judgment as a former judge of this state that the evidence assembled by Isabella Navarro Hale constituted sufficient grounds for a federal criminal investigation, and that the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin had been formally notified and had confirmed that an investigation was open. That last sentence moved through the crowd like a physical thing. Luther Crane, on the boardwalk, said something to Crow in a low voice. Crow didn't respond. He was looking at Whitlock with an expression that had finally lost its performance quality entirely. What was underneath was not the face of a man who had a plan. It was the face of a man who had run out of moves and was standing in the open with nowhere left to step. Someone in the crowd, Coulter never saw who, called out, "Let him answer for it." Not a roar, not a mob, just a voice, and then a murmur of agreement that moved through 50 people standing in a street on a Saturday morning. Coulter was standing off to the left, beside his father-in-law, watching all of it. He watched Crow on the boardwalk, and he watched Isabella in the center of the street, and he thought about the afternoon she'd ridden up to his fence line and told him she needed a husband, and she could do the fighting herself. He had believed her. He believed her more now. Crow stepped down from the boardwalk. The crowd shifted, not parting, not retreating, just adjusting, like a tide moving around something. He walked toward Isabella. Coulter watched him come and pushed off the fence post and moved to a position that was not aggressive but was present, close enough to matter, clearly visible. Crow stopped about 10 feet from Isabella. He looked at her with the expression of a man trying to find a version of this situation he can still manage. "This is inflammatory," he said. "These accusations are documented," Isabella said. She held up the journal. Every one of them, dated, witnessed, cross-referenced with county records. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You've been extorting this county for 6 years, Sheriff. You planted cattle on my husband's property to have him arrested when you realized we were getting close. You falsified a land survey to steal 40 feet of Ernesto Peña's pasture." She met his eyes steadily. "The federal marshals know all of it. They're coming." Crow looked at her. The pleasantness was completely gone from his face now. Not replaced by anger, which might have been easier, but by something colder and more calculating that was running out of things to calculate. "You've made a serious mistake," he said, quietly enough that most of the crowd couldn't hear it. "You made yours first," she said, at the same volume. He stood there a moment longer. Then he looked at the crowd. at the 50 people in the street, at Whitlock with his documents, at Brennan looking at the ground, at the Pena family standing together, at Ed Rafter and his brother-in-law side by side. And whatever he saw in all of those faces, it was not the thing he was accustomed to seeing. For 6 years, what he'd seen in faces was calculation. How much will it cost me to keep my head down? That calculation had run the county. It was gone now. What replaced it was something Crow had spent 6 years making sure he never had to look at directly. He turned and walked back toward his office. He walked without hurrying. He went inside and the door closed behind him. And Luther Crane and the deputies looked at each other, and then at the crowd, and then, one by one, found reasons to be elsewhere. The street was not silent. People began talking, to each other, to Isabella, to Whitlock. Someone clapped. It wasn't triumphant. It was the sound of relief that had been held in too long. Coulter came and stood beside Isabella. She was still holding the journal. She looked like she was very tired, in the bone-deep way of someone who has been running on adrenaline and sheer will for days and has just felt the ground stop moving under her. "It's not over," she said to him specifically, because she needed to say it to someone who understood it fully. "No," he agreed, "but it's different now." She looked up at him. Something moved across her face that was too many things at once to name cleanly. Relief and exhaustion and the particular satisfaction of a thing long and carefully built, finally holding its shape under weight. And something else underneath all of that. Something quieter. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you home." She nodded. Ramon appeared at her other side, and he put his hand on her back the way fathers do when their children have done something that leaves them without adequate words. And Isabella leaned into it briefly. Just a moment, just enough, before she straightened again and turned toward the horses. Behind them, the people of Red Creek County stood in the street they'd been afraid of for 6 years, and found that the air in it tasted different than it had an hour ago. Not safe yet, not clean yet, but different. And different that morning was enough to build on. The federal marshals arrived on a Tuesday, 11 days after the gathering on Main Street. There were 3 of them, 2 younger men and a senior marshal named Gideon Cross, who was in his 50s and had the particular unhurried quality of someone who had done this work long enough to know that urgency and haste were different things. He rode into Red Creek without announcement, went directly to the county courthouse, and spent the first 2 hours reading documentation before he spoke to anyone. Whitlock met with him that afternoon and spent 3 hours going through the evidence package. Cross asked questions that were precise and showed he'd read everything carefully before arriving. That evening, Cross came to the Hale Ranch. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ed Rafter had first unfolded his arms and let his guard down, where Isabella had laid out her journals month after month, where Coulter had drunk cold coffee and made the decision that changed the shape of his life. And he looked at Isabella across it with the evaluating eyes of a man who assessed people for a living. "You built this case yourself," he said. It came out with the same quality Whitlock's statement had carried. Not a compliment exactly, more like an acknowledgement of a fact that had surprised him. "With help," Isabella said. "The structure of it, the sequence of evidence, the way you cross-referenced the survey document with the installation record." He tapped the file in front of him. "Most people bring us accusations. You brought us a case. I brought you what I could document," she said. "The accusations were always there. Everyone in this county had accusations. Accusations alone don't move anything." Cross looked at her for a moment. "No," he agreed. "They don't." He turned to Coulter. "The cattle theft charge against you will be formally dropped. I've already spoken to Judge Foss, who is cooperating fully with our investigation." A pause that had something dry in it. Fully and enthusiastically, as of this afternoon. Coulter didn't ask what had made Foss enthusiastic. He had some guesses. "And Crow?" Coulter said. "Darius Crow will be arrested tomorrow morning, along with Deputy Luther Crane and 2 others. Cross closed the file. "The charges will include extortion, abuse of official authority, filing false documents with county records, conspiracy to commit fraud, and in Crane's case, complicity in the wrongful arrest." He looked at them both. "There will be a federal trial. It will take time. These things always take time. But the outcome," he paused carefully, "the evidence is substantial." Ramon, who had been sitting at the far end of the table so quietly that Cross had almost forgotten he was there, let out a slow breath that seemed to deflate something he'd been holding inflated for a very long time. My store, Ramon said. The payments he took, part of the restitution proceedings. I won't make promises I can't back up tonight, Mr. Navarro, but what was taken under extortion is recoverable in federal court. Ramon nodded. He looked at his hands on the table. He looked at Isabella. She reached over and covered his hands with hers and held them there. And he closed his eyes briefly. And that was the most either of them said about 3 years of monthly payments and broken windows and fear. Cross left an hour later with the full evidence package and the promise that his office would be in contact. After his horse disappeared down the wagon road, the three of them sat at the table in the quiet of the kitchen for a while without speaking. It was Ramon who finally said something. I want chicken for dinner. Coulter looked at him. I haven't wanted anything specific to eat in months, Ramon said, with a slightly embarrassed dignity. I want chicken with the potatoes. Isabella laughed. It was the real laugh, the one she couldn't stop. Coulter watched her and felt something in his chest do a thing he'd stopped expecting it to do some years back. He got up and went to look in the larder. They arrested Crow the next morning. Coulter heard about it secondhand from Ed Rafter, who'd been in town when it happened. Cross and his 2 deputies had gone to the sheriff's office at 7 in the morning. Crow had been at his desk. He had looked at the federal arrest warrant and at the 3 men holding it and had said nothing for a long moment, and then he had stood up and allowed himself to be cuffed without resistance. He had walked out of his own office between 2 federal marshals and into the street that he'd owned for 6 years. And the people who saw it had mostly been silent. Ed said, "Nobody cheered. Nobody said anything. They just watched." "That's right," Coulter said. "I thought people would—" Ed paused. "I don't know what I thought." When something's been wrong for a long time, seeing it corrected doesn't feel like winning, Coulter said. It feels like finally being able to exhale. Ed thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what it felt like." Luther Crane was arrested at his house. The 2 other deputies were picked up before noon. By the time the sun was directly overhead, Darius Crow and 3 of the men who had built his operation with him were in federal custody and on their way out of Red Creek County. The county was without a sheriff for 6 weeks while the state organized an interim appointment. Those 6 weeks were not seamless. Nothing is seamless in the absence of something that's been holding a shape, even when what was holding the shape was rotten. There were disputes, confusion, a land argument between 2 ranchers that had nothing to do with Crow, but that Crow had been suppressing for his own reasons. There was a period of not knowing who was in charge of what, which was uncomfortable for everyone. But it was honest discomfort, the kind that comes from real problems working themselves out, rather than being buried under a layer of enforced silence. People argued and complained and then, for the most part, worked things out, because the alternative was continuing to argue and complain, and most people would rather get something resolved than be right indefinitely. The county commissioner, the one who had done nothing 8 months ago when Ramon went to him, resigned quietly in the 4th week. He sent a letter to the county that said he was stepping down for personal reasons. Nobody publicly called him a coward for it, though privately opinions varied. Ernesto Peña's east pasture was surveyed again by an independent assessor brought in from the next county over. The assessment confirmed what the fraudulent survey had concealed. The boundary was 40 feet east of where Crow's cousin had placed it. The correction was filed with county records on a Thursday afternoon without ceremony, and Ernesto drove fence posts back into the correct ground himself, with his oldest son beside him, and didn't say much about it to anyone. He didn't need to. The fence was where it was supposed to be. The restitution proceedings were slow, as Cross had warned. Federal legal processes don't accommodate impatience, and there were months of paperwork and hearings and the particular frustrating machinery of official things working at official speeds. Ramon recovered about 2/3 of what had been taken from him over 3 years, which was less than everything and considerably more than nothing, and he received the amount without the satisfaction he'd imagined he would feel. "I thought getting it back would feel better," he told Coulter one evening on the porch. "It's money," Coulter said. "Money being returned doesn't undo the time it was gone." Ramon looked at him sideways. "You have an annoying habit of being accurate." "So I've been told." Ramon was quiet for a moment. The evening was cooling around them. It was October now, the first real fall weather coming through, and the air had a quality to it that felt like something finished and something beginning at the same time. My daughter tells me you're not much for conversation, he said. She says that a lot. She also tells me, he stopped, seemed to reconsider. She doesn't tell me much, actually. She never has. She did tell me that she's glad she chose you. Coulter looked at the darkening land for a moment. I'm glad she did too. Don't let her hear you say that too easily, Ramon said, with a dry amusement. She'll think you're not paying attention. Coulter considered that. She doesn't miss much. No, she never has. He paused. Her mother was the same way. It's a difficult quality to live beside. It's a more difficult quality to live without. He said it simply, about a woman who'd been gone for 15 years, and the simplicity of it landed on Coulter with more weight than an elaborate grief would have. He thought about Margaret and about the years after, and about the particular way a house sounds when there's only one person in it. I know, he said. They sat together in the cooling air and said nothing else for a while, which was, by that point, one of the more comfortable silences in Coulter's life. The celebration, when it happened, was nothing any of them had planned. It was a Saturday in early November, about 5 weeks after the arrests, and someone, to this day no one agreed on who had started it, put out word that people were gathering at the Aldridge feed store that evening, and would there be food, and there would be food. And by 6 o'clock, there were people overflowing from Tom Aldridge's store onto the street outside with plates in their hands and conversations going in all directions. It was not elegant. Tom's wife had made 3 pies and a thing with dried corn and peppers that was good, but nobody was quite sure what to call it. Ed Rafter brought a jug of something he'd been aging since spring and refused to specify the contents of. The widow Parrish brought bread and the kind of good cheese that signaled a woman who'd decided to stop saving the good things for special occasions and had concluded that surviving intact was special enough. Ernesto and Clara Peña came with their kids, who ran in and out of the store door with the total indifference to adult gravity that children bring to all situations, serious or otherwise. Brennan came and stood near the edge of things for a while, nursing a cup of something and not talking much, but he was there, and being there was what mattered. Whitlock came, which surprised everyone, because he was generally understood to be a man who avoided crowds, and he stood against the wall with a plate of food and talked to Ramon for an hour about something that made them both laugh more than once. Coulter spent most of the evening doing what he usually did at gatherings, moving through the edges, exchanging a few words here and there, not performing sociability he didn't feel, but not absent either. Tom Aldridge found him near the back and shook his hand and held it a beat longer than a handshake required. I almost didn't do it, Tom said. Backed out twice. You know that. I know. I keep thinking about what would have happened if... He stopped. If she hadn't kept pushing. If you hadn't come to talk to me that day. You made your own choice, Coulter said. Both times you backed out, you came back. That was you. Tom shook his head. I needed someone to come back for. Coulter didn't have an answer to that felt adequate, so he just nodded, and Tom went back to his guests, and Coulter stood there thinking about what that meant. The way people sometimes needed to borrow courage from a structure larger than themselves until they could stand in it on their own. It wasn't weakness, that borrowing. It was just how things actually worked, as opposed to how people liked to think they worked. Isabella found him near the door later. She had a plate with things on it that she'd mostly eaten, and she looked tired in the comfortable way of someone tired from a good evening rather than from dread. You've been standing near exits all night, she said. Habit. It's not a criticism. She stood beside him looking at the room, all of it, the people and the noise and the kids running and Tom's inexplicable corn dish and the widow Parrish laughing at something Whitlock had said. It's a lot, she said. It is. Good lot or too much lot? He thought about it genuinely. Good lot, he decided. Just lot. She nodded. A pause. Daniel, Ed's brother-in-law, he told me tonight he's going to apply to lease the county land again. The land he's been on for 6 years. She looked at her plate. He said he figured it was worth trying now, since the people reviewing the application wouldn't be doing it with a particular set of instructions anymore. He'll get it, Coulter said. Probably. She glanced at him. He also said, and I'm telling you this because you should hear it, he said the reason he finally agreed to come forward was because you rode out there twice, and the second time you didn't say anything persuasive. You just sat with him and waited. Coulter remembered that. He hadn't had anything persuasive left by the second visit, so he just stayed present until Daniel was ready to say what he was going to say. I didn't have a better option, Coulter said. That's the most useful kind of thing, Isabella said. When there's no better option and you just stay. He looked at her. She was looking at the room, not at him, with that quality she had of saying something real while appearing to be talking about something else. He'd been learning to catch it. Isabella, he said. She turned. I'm glad you rode onto my property, he said. That afternoon. I'm glad you made the case you made. Something moved across her face. The guarded thing that usually lived there did something complicated. You made it easy, she said. You said yes. You picked the right person to ask. I did a lot of research, she said, with a faint dryness that was her version of deflection. I know you did. He looked at her steadily. And then you rode out there and made the case and waited to see if I was who you thought I was. A pause. Were you? I'm still figuring that out, he said. But I think so, mostly. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she did something that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. An expression he'd been seeing more of in recent months that lived on her face when she wasn't managing it. Mostly is honest, she said. Mostly is what we've got. It's enough. He thought about the word enough, and what it had meant to him at different points in his life. There had been a time when enough meant bare minimum. Just enough to get through, just enough to keep the ranch going, just enough of a life to call it one. He'd called that contentment because it was quieter than admitting it was something he'd settled into when the bigger things felt too far away to reach for. He didn't think that anymore. He wasn't sure when he'd stopped thinking it. The November air came in through the open door and moved through the warm room, and outside, the stars were coming in over Red Creek County, the same stars that had been there for every year of Crow's management and every year before that, indifferent to the human arrangements below them, and yet somehow always there when a person needed something to look at that was larger than the problem in front of them. The town was not fixed. The county was not healed. Those things take years, and some of the damage from 6 years of organized corruption doesn't come fully undone. It changes the soil of a place. The way people's trust in institutions grows back slower and more carefully. The way certain conversations still lower a voice before they're remembered to be safe. But the machinery that had been holding all of it in place was gone, and the people who had been told, quietly and persistently, that there was nothing to be done, that this was just how things were in Red Creek County, that the smart move was to pay and keep your head down and not make trouble for yourself. Those people had stood in a street and said something different out loud, and the saying of it had mattered, and they all knew it had mattered, and that knowledge was not nothing. It was, in fact, the most consequential thing that had happened in that county in years. Not the arrests, though the arrests were necessary. Not the legal proceedings, though the legal proceedings were real and ongoing. The most consequential thing was 50 people deciding, on the same morning, that the story they'd been given about their own powerlessness was not the true story. You can't unlearn that. Once a person has stood up and the ground held under them, they know it's possible. They carry that knowledge differently than they carried the fear. That was what Isabella Navarro had understood. From the beginning, even when she'd ridden alone out to a stranger's fence line with a proposition that sounded desperate and was anything but. She hadn't just been building a legal case. She'd been building a proof, demonstrating, with evidence and structure and the particular discipline of someone who believed in the power of documented truth, that the machine Crow had built was not as solid as it looked, that it had cracks, and that cracks, given the right pressure in the right place, open. She was not a perfect person. She was impatient with slowness that she found unnecessary. She held grudges with more precision than she sometimes admitted. She reorganized spaces without asking and was almost always right about the reorganization, which was its own kind of irritating. She had spent so long being the person who handled things that accepting help still sat crooked on her, still required a conscious and sometimes visible adjustment. Coulter was not a perfect person either. He withdrew when he should have spoken. He had 11 years of solitary habits that were slow to yield and occasionally genuinely inconvenient. He was still sometimes surprised to walk into his kitchen and find it occupied and warm, and the surprise had a complicated texture, part pleasure, part the residue of years of getting used to absence. They were figuring it out. That was the honest description. They were figuring it out in the particular way that people who are both somewhat stubborn and both actually try and figure things out, with friction and adjustment and the occasional evening where the silence between them had an edge to it, and the occasional morning where it didn't, and the accumulation of days that slowly, without announcement, became something they were both inside of. It was not a romance that had declared itself in a moment. It was something built in increments, the way the case had been built, one documented incident at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one shared evening on the porch at a time, until the porch felt like somewhere both of them belonged. The ranch did well that winter. Coulter had kept the herd stable through the drought and the disruptions, and with the legal cloud lifted and the cattle theft charge formally dismissed, the buyers who had sent cautious letters came back with less cautious ones. He expanded the north pasture fence, properly this time, with posts that would last, and hired a hand named Willie, 18 years old and willing to learn, who showed up every morning with a punctuality that suggested either exceptional character or a very bad alternative at home. Ramon reopened the mercantile with a new front window, real plate glass this time, wider than the old one, and a sign that was the same sign he'd had for 30 years, because he liked the sign. Business came back gradually, the way trust comes back, which is not all at once and not in a straight line, but in accumulated small decisions by people who had needed to see whether it was safe before they came back fully. By spring, the store was doing better than it had in 4 years. The county elected a new sheriff in February, a man named Asa Bright from the Western District, who had a reputation for being aggressively uninteresting and making decisions based on what the law actually said. He was not dramatic. He did not have a particular personal magnetism. He showed up to his job and did it without theater, and the absence of theater was the most reassuring thing Red Creek County had experienced in years. Whitlock, who had lived 7 miles outside the county seat in deliberate semi-retirement for 3 years, started coming into town more. He had coffee with Ramon on Thursday mornings and occasionally stopped into the county courthouse to review public records, not because anyone asked him to, but because he'd been watching things go sideways for years from a safe distance and had decided he was done with the distance. He didn't announce this change, he just started showing up. Spring came in warm and wet, which after the previous summer's drought felt like an overcorrection that nobody was complaining about. The creek beds that had cracked into plates of dry mud filled and ran properly for the first time in 2 years. Coulter's pastures came in green. Things grew. On a morning in April, Coulter was mending fence on the south pasture. The same fence, the same basic work that he'd been doing when Isabella rode up on her bay mare nearly a year before, and he heard hoofbeats on the wagon road. He straightened and pushed his hat back and watched, because the sound of hoofbeats on that road had a different quality for him now than it had before. It was Isabella coming back from town where she'd been meeting with a woman from the North District who had approached her quietly about a situation with a land lease that sounded, in the description, like something Isabella would want to know about. She'd been going to those meetings more and more, people finding their way to her, because word had moved through the county about the woman who'd kept the records and stood in the street and said the true thing out loud. She hadn't set up anything formal. She just listened and asked questions and wrote things down when things were worth writing down. She pulled up near him on the fence line and looked at him from the saddle and said, "The Kellerman lease. It's the county works surveyor again. Different man, same approach." Coulter looked at her. Same surveyor's office? Different man, but the same method. They're disputing a boundary on a lease renewal. She had a look in her eyes that he recognized. "I need to go to the county records." "When?" "Tomorrow." "I'll come with you." She tilted her head slightly. "You don't need to. I know you can," he said. "I'll come anyway." She looked at him for a moment with that expression on her face, the one that wasn't quite a smile, that lived on her when she wasn't managing it, something easy and real. "Okay," she said. He went back to the fence. She didn't ride off immediately. She stayed on the mare for a moment, watching him work, and he was aware of it the way you become aware of warmth. "Coulter," she said. He looked up. "The bay mare's pregnant." He blinked. "How long have you known?" "The farrier mentioned it this morning." "You're telling me now?" "I'm telling you now." She had a quality in her voice that was trying not to be amused and wasn't fully succeeding. He looked at the mare. He looked at Isabella. "We need a bigger barn." Probably. That's a spring project. I know. I've been thinking about where to expand it. She finally turned the mare toward the house. Over her shoulder. I already have a drawing. I'll show you tonight. He watched her ride back up toward the house. This woman who had ridden onto his property with a desperate plan and turned out to be neither desperate nor without a plan. Who had built a case that brought down a corrupt machine and reorganized his kitchen shelves and was, already, drawing plans for a barn expansion that she hadn't told him about because she'd been waiting until she had it figured out enough to defend it. He thought about what it cost her to do things like that. To need to have it figured first, to need to be sure. He thought about what it had taken for her to ride to a stranger and say, I need help, even when she'd wrapped the asking in such a thorough architecture of competence that it almost looked like she wasn't asking at all. He turned back to the fence. There was a particular thing he had come to understand in the past year that he hadn't known how to articulate before, and it was this. The life he'd been living before Isabella rode onto his land was not a full life that was interrupted. It was a half-life that was completed. He hadn't known it was half because he'd had nothing to compare it to. No one beside him, no friction against which to understand his own shape, no one whose competence made him examine his own. He'd been a man alone on land he cared for, doing good work, and he had called that enough because it was easier than knowing it wasn't. He didn't think that was weakness. He thought it was just human, the way people find a livable shape for the life they have and call it the life they wanted, because the alternative is grieving for something you don't know how to name. He'd been doing that for 11 years. He wasn't doing it anymore, and the difference was not that the ranch was better or the work was lighter. The difference was that he knew what he was building it with, and who he was building it beside and why. The fence line needed 3 more posts before the section was sound. He worked until mid-afternoon with the particular focus of a man doing physical work that his mind is only partly in, the rest of it somewhere warm and inhabited, in a kitchen that had been reorganized into something better, in a house that sounded like people were in it, in a life that he had not planned and would not trade. Out in the south pasture, the new grass was coming in green and thick. The creek was running. The cattle were moving through the field in their slow, unhurried way, doing what cattle do when the land is good and the fences hold and the season is kind. Red Creek County was not a perfect place. It had never been. It had corruption built into its history the way all places do, and the removal of one corrupt man and his apparatus didn't fix everything that was wrong with how power arranged itself in small counties in the state of Texas. There would be other problems, other battles, other ordinary people who needed to find out whether the ground would hold when they stood on it. But Isabella Navarro Hale had shown one way that it could be done. Not with a hero, not with a single dramatic act, but with a journal and a 14-month habit of writing down the truth and a willingness to ride out to a stranger's fence line and ask for what she needed. And Coulter Hale had shown something too, quieter but no less real, that sometimes the most necessary thing a person can do is simply refuse to look for the door. The evening came in over the flats, slow and orange, the way it did in spring when the air was still clean. Somewhere in the house, something was being cooked that smelled of cumin and peppers. Ramon's laugh came through an open window, prompted by something. A young ranch hand was finishing his last task of the day with the thoroughness of someone trying to prove something. Coulter washed his hands at the pump and walked to the porch and stopped there for a moment before going inside. He looked at the land. His land. Their land. The same flat piece of West Texas he'd been working for 11 years. And it looked back at him the way land always does. Patient, indifferent, entirely dependent on whoever was caring for it. He was caring for it. He was not doing it alone. He went inside.